Having an offshore bank account, and I would argue a portfolio of offshore bank accounts, is more important than ever as a strategy to diversify your money and give yourself legal asset protection. Today I'm going to walk you through some of the most important factors for how to choose the right bank and the right country. All the usual caveats apply. Obviously, you want to talk to someone like Nomad Capitalist with our network of accountants and attorneys and all kinds of professionals. We can certainly advise you on what are the requirements in your country. Do I need to report the account? Let's say if you're an American and your account meets some pretty basic criteria, you need to report your foreign bank account. So we're going to set all that aside. I'm going to assume that you're going to follow the laws because we do encourage people to do things legally here. And certainly there's different ways to go about finding an offshore bank account. You may look at certain countries first. You might think, Switzerland, that's where I want to bank. Perhaps an overrated kind of name brand. Certainly there are some utility among Swiss banks. The average person probably is not going to find it to be as good as they thought it was. You might also hear about a particular bank either from our channel or from a friend or wherever else. So you can certainly start the search with a country and then go deeper there, or with the name of a bank and then kind of research the country. So I'm going to go through 7 criteria that you're going to want to look at to make sure that you get the right bank account or bank accounts for you. If it's your first time here, my name is Andrew Henderson, the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We are a boutique consultancy that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally go where you're treated best, from lowering your taxes, diversifying your assets with things like offshore bank accounts, getting second passports, just basically using the world as your oyster to increase your wealth and your freedom. We're also the host of the biggest and best offshore conference called Nomad Capitalist Live, open to absolutely everybody. So the first question that you want to ask yourself is the jurisdiction. What is the country? What's the territory where the bank account is in? Number one, is it open, widely speaking, to your nationality? You don't really see a lot of kind of jurisdiction-wide restrictions on nationalities. Like Switzerland isn't the one saying, hey, we don't want Americans. It's just that most Swiss banks are, because of their branding, because they are a name brand, because they've been around and they're exclusive enough and they don't have to go out and beg for people's money, they can afford to say, hey, Americans are too much work. But that has become a thing in places like Switzerland, in places like Liechtenstein. In Singapore, Americans are often welcome, but a number of the larger banks won't let them make investments because of investment restrictions between how they operate and what the SEC would allow. And so you want to understand how open a jurisdiction is to your nationality. On the other hand, you look at some of the places that we've talked about over the years, Ecuador or Georgia, for example. These are places where they're looking to bring money in the door. And so it's not always applying. I mean, we just saw recently, for example, Armenian banks generally don't want non-residents anymore. If you're in, you can stay in most cases, and I've seen it a lot of times where a bank account is no longer available. I've been grandfathered in. I've seen others grandfathered in. But they decided, hey, it's just not worth it anymore. I'm not entirely sure why a lot of the banks have decided that, but other banks in other countries in that situation where they're like, hey, we're trying to become a bigger banking sector, we're trying to increase our market share, are going to be more open. It just makes sense, right? I mean, you wanted to move to Singapore in the 1970s, it was wide open, right? That's when it was starting to move its way up. Now they don't need you anymore, and so you want to understand about jurisdictions. Obviously, some jurisdictions are safer than others. That comes down to the certain laws. It comes down to the general quality. I don't necessarily, though, want to look at things like deposit insurance, for example, because you can have some great banks and jurisdictions that have all the legal framework, but maybe other banks there aren't that great. But you can have, there were banks even in like Lebanon that were widely reputed as very good banks. And so the jurisdiction may not be able to back up your deposits that well, but the bank itself, maybe there's a larger bank that has a branch in a country that you're kind of like, really? But that larger bank makes sure that there's proper liquidity in that. And so you could have a safe bank in a place where there's zero deposit insurance, for example. And so you have places in the Gulf where the government is kind of known to say, hey, if there's a problem, we're going to step in, but there's not a technical FDIC or CDIC or that kind of program. Okay, so I would also lastly look at, is the jurisdiction a name brand? Switzerland or Liechtenstein, kind of the Prada and the Louis Vuitton, or the Goyard, perhaps you want to say, of offshore banking. Is that bad? No. And if you have $10 million to put in, then there are some decent banks that will help you. I found in some of those jurisdictions a little bit too much friction. Even if you want to put in a bunch of money, just a little bit too much friction. Definitely a place where you more want your money managed, and so you also understand the perception of what places are looking for. A lot of European banks just want to manage your money for you. They're going to choose stuff. They're going to be doing structured notes and all kinds of different stuff. If you're just looking to go and buy some stocks and put some cash away, a lot of the higher level European banks may not be for you, and you want to understand that that's kind of their expectation really in a lot of those jurisdictions on a more wide basis, at least for non-residents. Certainly, if you're concerned about something happening, let's say that you come from Mexico and you're concerned about what's happened historically in some of the banks down there with the cartels, and you want to go and make sure, hey, I want strong bank privacy. I want bank secrecy, not because I'm necessarily trying to hide the money from the government, but I'm trying to hide the money from other folks. I don't want people to know how much money I have because I'm from a place where people do know how much money I have. So what are the laws in terms of asset protection, bank secrecy? We're not talking about sidestepping government restrictions in terms of reporting accounts. Not every country requires you to report your accounts, but you do want to check. What about bail-ins, for example? Look at what happened in Cyprus. Look at some of the rules put in place in countries like Australia. Can they bail in your money? And you're seeing some of the more Western countries that are starting to put those rules in. Not all the European countries, but some of them do concern us. Places like Canada, places like Australia. Look at what they've just done, where they just come in and freeze people's bank accounts because they don't agree with you. That is one argument that I do think supports banking in a place where you don't live, is if you bank in Singapore, you can say whatever you want, but are you actually going to go out there and be protesting things happening in Singapore? No. You put your money there, they run their own country, you live somewhere else, and so that's going to be, in my opinion, a stronger form of kind of asset protection from a censorship point of view. But you want to look at these things, asset protection, bail-ins, etc. Let's next talk about the third criteria, travel. Number one, do I need to travel to get to the bank? And again, this can somewhat be on a jurisdictional level. We'll see banks, let's say, in Portugal. We've created a whole system of opening accounts through power of attorney. And so it seems on a relatively wide level, at least with some of the more international focused banks, you can do that without the need to travel. There's kind of a multi-step process of opening those accounts remotely that Portugal was okay with that. You've got other jurisdictions like Singapore where they generally don't do that. A brokerage account, maybe. A bank account, unless you already have an account, let's say at Standard Chartered in your country, they're going to make you go there in Singapore. That's just going to be the standard. So do you need to travel there? Obviously, every bank has their individual provisions. Do you want to be close to the jurisdiction? Are you able to get into the jurisdiction? Right? So if you're banking in Singapore, right now the standard is to get into Singapore, you need a vaccination certificate. And so if you aren't vaccinated and you don't want to be vaccinated and you want to go there and you think like, hey, I want to be able to go to the physical bank, I don't want to just do online banking. You don't need to go to the bank, right? Because you can do everything online. It's different than a lot of, let's say, US banks where like, oh, you're sending $20,000, you got to come in and fill out a form. No, they don't do that. I send money all the time from Singapore. I don't go there. But if you want that desire and that gives you the comfort and you're saying like, oh, well, it's been closed to me. Or, you're saying, hey, I have a Caribbean citizenship by investment. I need a visa to go to Canada. I don't want to bank in Canada. Right? Well, that's good because they wouldn't open it for you if you didn't go there anyway. But like, these are the questions you have to ask yourself. I think that a lot of times traveling to the country, number one, gives you a sense of confidence with what's going on there. And it kind of helps you build the offshore plan more. But nothing wrong with opening an account through a power of attorney, for example. Some banks do allow remote, like in some of the more traditional offshore jurisdictions, whether it's in the South Pacific, Cook Islands of Vanuatu, whether it's some of the ones in the Caribbean. You're probably going to pay higher fees, and you're probably going to have less stable banks with a few caveats in those areas. But they don't require you to travel. So would you rather pay and go on a trip and open an account that's maybe going to be more of a retail account with fewer fees or more of a high-level investment account, or do you want something where you don't have to go there? And again, do you want to be able to go to the jurisdiction, or does that matter to you? All right. The next quality is quality of the bank. Stability. How stable is the bank? Of course, you want to look at their different financial metrics. You want to look at, are they a publicly traded company? Who's the ownership? I mean, there's some, banks that look very small, but they're owned by, some billionaire family, and the family has kind of a conglomerate, and it's just part of their international conglomerate. Maybe that makes you feel comfortable. Maybe it doesn't. There are plenty of great banks in lesser quality countries. There are some banks that I think are pretty well managed in, let's say, Cambodia. And again, many of those banks are either Southeast Asian banks or they are East Asian banks that have a presence and came down to Cambodia, or someone from East Asia came and bought a bank there. So is that like the top quality jurisdiction? No, not really. But I think some of those banks are well run and well financed. And so also you might look at things like, what's the online banking like? A lot of the traditional offshore banks are not going to have robust online banking. A more retail bank where they have a local clientele or a high-level clientele is going to develop more robust banking. That said, I've seen some banks, again, like in Liechtenstein, you need a couple $1,000,000. I'm not impressed with the online banking because, again, it's designed based on some olden days formula of you give us your money and we'll manage it, and don't ask any of the questions, and that'll all be fine. And so something like a Singapore, for example, robust online banking, some of the best online banking. Even countries like Georgia, I mean, really nice, user-friendly banking. But those are retail banking environments, not Caribbean island banks with higher fees. So what is the quality of the bank? Service and services are other qualities that you want to look at. So what are the bank services in terms of, is it just putting in cash? When I talk to people about, do you want some bank accounts? They're like, okay, but just make them small. Sure, you can get small bank accounts in some of the countries that I've just mentioned, some of these up-and-coming countries. If that's cool with you, hey, put 10 grand in this account, put 20 grand, put 1 grand, right? Probably most people aren't going to freak out about putting $1,000 in some bank account. I mean, I think I've still got like $10 in some Mongolian bank account, and every month they send me a letter or an email saying that my account's been closed. It's like, all right, great, you can keep the $10, and maybe you don't feel that much differently about 1,000. But you don't have to necessarily keep just cash in there. If you go to a bank that offers a brokerage arm built in, you can trade stocks. And so in many cases, let's say you go to Singapore, they're going to open up numerous Asian markets you can trade. They may offer access, again in Singapore, to, let's say, certain Singapore government debt that has higher yields than a lot of other stuff right now in terms of that category. You might have access to European markets. You might have access to other services. Let's say you're nomadic and it's like, where do I live in terms of where do I purchase life insurance? A high-level bank may offer that kind of service to you. And so what is the service in terms of who, are you getting a banker? Again, I've had experiences in Europe where bankers don't really know. They claim to help with tax and they know nothing about tax on investments. They claim to be high-level banks and they'll tell you it takes 3 weeks to get back to you. They'll be kind of cocky about it. And then you'll go to a place like in Asia, whether it's Singapore, I think Malaysia has some pretty strong banks, you have to be a resident, and you'll get service where it's just, you're on WhatsApp and the guy gets back to you in 5 minutes sometimes. So what are the services they offer in terms of investments, in terms of life insurance, in terms of access to markets, in terms of, sometimes there's some tax advisory, I generally don't really put much stock in that, and how good is the quality of the service. And then lastly, what is the management required from you? So what do they require to get the account set up? If you're going to set up an account again in Europe at a high-level bank, be ready to provide substantial documentation. They're going to check every single detail. Any bank is, but they're going to check every single detail of a lot more stuff. They're going to ask you some questions. And so if you don't want that level of involvement, then I wouldn't go and open any multi-million-dollar account. You can look at accounts in Asia, for example, where there's kind of the entry level, couple $100,000, and there's due diligence, and they make sure that you're a good person, your money's good. But if you want the $5 million private bank experience, there's going to be a lot more due diligence, and so you may just get the same value. Even if you have $5 million, you may just put it in at the $200,000 or the $500,000 level, and that may be better than having to constantly go through the enhanced due diligence for not requiring those extra services. You just have more money to deposit. And so, a smaller bank, a retail bank, is generally going to have a more streamlined process. An offshore bank where they don't see you is going to have a less streamlined process. They're going to charge you fees all along the way because they need to be very careful, especially in the really small jurisdictions like a Caribbean island. Do you need to be there to make transactions? I would say if you're getting a bank account, you want to have be able to send any amount of money online. Now, again, a more retail-focused bank, if you start sending millions of dollars around in transactions, they're going to ask you some questions, and they may even get freaked out and just close your account. So have that conversation about what they expect of you, what you can expect of them. But really, when I talk to folks from the US and Canada who are like, I had to go into my bank, I'm like, what? Who's going into their bank to make a transaction for any amount of money? Even, with a bank where they say, okay, the app maximum is $200,000 to send a wire. Above that, they call you and you have a PIN and you've got another PIN and they just verify it and they send it up manually. But you're not going in. And so what is the level of management on your part? There are some banks that certainly if you want to open an account in the US, you may have to have that. And so that comes back to travel and all the other things. So understanding how much effort you've got to put in to keep the account going, whether it's from providing additional documents, whether it's from kind of updating them. Listen, there's some banks that they want to know every transaction. You get $7. What's this? Fill out this form. Tell us what it is. I don't really deal with that very much. I think we have 1 or 2 accounts in the business like that, and that's kind of more standard on a business side. Here's an invoice. Okay, great. On the personal side, that's a little bit much. And so if that was a requirement, maybe you don't want to work with that bank. But those are some factors to look at when you're picking an offshore bank. I happen to think that you want different accounts for different purposes. Some are cash, some are more investments. If you're doing international investments like buying real estate, you want different jurisdictions around the world that understand that, right? So if you're buying property in Dubai, you're probably going to have a better experience sending that money from somewhere in that region than you are sending it from the US or from Canada, right, where they might kind of get freaked out about that. So those are some things to consider, and you can start building your banking profile. If you have a question on offshore banking that you would like us to answer, leave it in the comment section below.